We begin today's show in Syria. Pro-government forces have seized control of the key border town of Qusayr, which had been controlled by rebel fighters for the past year. Qusayr, which lies on a cross-border supply route with neighboring Lebanon, had been the site of a fierce battle over the past 2 weeks as fighters from the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah joined forces aligned with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Since fighting broke out over 2 years ago in Syria, more than 80,000 people have been killed and another 1.6 million Syrian refugees have fled. Earlier this week, the United Nations accused both sides of the Syrian conflict of reaching, quote, new levels of brutality. UN panel chair Paulo Pinheiro accused government forces of murder, torture, rape, forcible displacement and other acts, many of them carried out systematically against civilians. But he said anti-Assad rebels were guilty of similar atrocities.
Anti-government armed groups have also committed war crimes, including murder, sentencing, and execution without due process, torture, hostage-taking and pillage. They continue to endanger the civilian population by positioning military objectives in civilian areas. And as we said in the past, there is a disparity between the violations or the crimes committed by the government forces and those committed by the rebels. But this is a disparity in intensity. It's not in disparity in the very nature of the crimes and violations. They are the same.
In its report, the United Nations said they had, quote, reasonable grounds to believe that limited amounts of chemical weapons had been used in Syria. The UN investigators said they had received allegations that Syrian government forces and rebels had both used the banned weapons. But the UN report lacked details. Meanwhile, France said tests on chemical samples taken from Syria prove the deadly nerve agent sarin gas has been used several times during the conflict. But France did not give any details of where or by whom the poison gas had been used. This is Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius.
A line has been crossed, unquestionably. There is the United Nations approach. Apart from that, we are discussing with our partners, the United States, the English, etc., what eventual reaction will have to be given. All the options are on the table.
In response to France's claim, White House spokesman Jay Carney told reporters we need more information about claims of such use. The Syrian conflict has fueled sectarian tensions across the Middle East. In the northern Lebanese city of Tripoli, 6 people were killed in clashes Monday. In Iraq, more than 500 people were killed in May, while more than 700 died in April, marking the bloodiest month there in nearly 5 years. Meanwhile, the Obama administration's announced that Patriot missiles and F-16 fighter jets deployed to Jordan for a military exercise may be kept there due to the violence in Syria. Our next guest recently returned from Syria, has reported on how the conflict is spreading in the Middle East. Patrick Coburn is a longtime correspondent with The Independent of London. Patrick, welcome back to Democracy Now! Describe what is happening in Syria and what you're saying is the reverberations of this throughout the Middle East.
Well, the war gets more and more intense. The fighting gets heavier, but I think we also have a stalemate. The government has been quite successfully advancing, has just taken the town of Qusayr, as you mentioned, and has also moved south towards the Jordanian border. But the impression I get is that there was an exaggerated idea in the last 2 years that Assad was going to go down. When I'm in Beirut, people last year, earlier this year, people were speaking as if, his days were numbered. But as soon as I get to Damascus, this isn't so obvious at all. I could drive from Damascus up to Homs, which is the third biggest city in Syria, about 100 miles away, without any guards. There wasn't any shooting on the road. So I think there was always an exaggerated idea that Assad was about to go down. The other big change in the Syrian conflict is the way it's very visibly spreading. It's spread to Lebanon. The Hezbollah has been taking part in the latest fighting. Anti-government forces have been shelling positions in Lebanon. And in Iraq, we're practically back to the days of the Civil War. I mean, you mentioned that according to some figures, 500 Iraqis died last month in May. According to the UN, it was 1,000. I'm not quite sure why the disparity is there. But you can sense in Baghdad, where I was also quite recently, that people are very tense. They feel that they're very close to a sectarian civil war between Sunni and Shia. And the number of people being killed has reached the level that it was last seen in 2008, 5 years ago.
Patrick Coburn, you say that there's a military stalemate in Syria. Could you explain how much of the country remains under the control of Bashar al-Assad and how much is under the control of opposition forces?
Right. I mean, what surprised me over the last sort of year is that you'd hear foreign leaders say Assad is about to go down, or alternatively, his departure should be a precondition of any talks, while at the same time Assad controls and has controlled all but one, I think there are 16 provincial capitals in Syria, and he held 15 of them. So they hold most of the population centers. They hold a lot of the main roads. So the opposition tends to hold areas in the country, particularly in the north and in the east, in the northeast. They've been losing ground in the center and in the south. I don't think that the government, Assad's forces, are going to win a complete victory, but I think that they are rather more than holding their own. They're advancing. Overall, there's a stalemate. I think the opposition will hold on to the areas it controls in the north. These are Sunni Muslim areas. I don't think it'll lose out entirely. It can resupply across the Turkish border, but it's certainly on the back foot at the moment. Probably the key thing to look at when we see what happens in Aleppo, which is the second biggest city in Syria.
Can you talk about the significance of Qusayr on the Lebanese border and the shifting of hands back to pro-government forces?
Yeah, I think people speak about it as being a sort of supply center. This is true. It's close to Homs, which is big city, and was sort of mostly under government control, not entirely. And supplies and reinforcements were moving through Qusayr, so there's a military loss. On the other hand, it's not the very main supply line of the rebels. That mainly comes through Turkey. Most of the Turkish border is no longer controlled by the government. Those are the main supply lines. Most of the ammunition and weapons are coming through there. But there's another very important thing about Qusayr, that it's a very visible government victory. For 2 years, it looked as though the government was losing ground, maybe slowly losing ground, and there was a feeling of inevitability for a lot of the time that Assad would eventually go. That isn't there anymore. And one of the reasons it isn't there is that the war has spread, that it's not just, at the beginning you could describe this war as being maybe primarily a popular uprising against a dictatorial government, but now so many other conflicts have fed in, including the whole Shia-Sunni dispute in the Middle East. The Shia in Iraq and Lebanon feel threatened, so they're pitching in. That's not surprising. And as Hezbollah has decided to make a full commitment to what it sees as its side in the Syrian civil war, so that's a big change.
Patrick Coburn, you've written recently about the splits within the Syrian opposition forces and their criticism of the leadership outside of Syria. Could you explain who comprises the opposition forces and what's happening with them?
Sure, yeah. I mean, even by the standards of Iraq, the opposition forces are not just split, but chaotic. I mean, there's a division between the military units in Syria, mostly sort of independent brigades, maybe sometimes, under 100 people, sometimes over 1,000 different brigades, but nobody really controlling them. They have different sort of paymasters and suppliers outside. You have the Free Syrian Army, but that sounds a bit more united than in fact it is. And then you have the al-Qaeda type organizations, which the al-Nusra Front, which is better organized, better disciplined, fights harder, but obviously is regarded with aversion by the US and various other people on the outside. But then you have the Syrian National Coalition, you have the outside political forces who, are almost recognized certainly by the UK and France as the next government of Syria, but they're completely disunited. They've generally depended for money on Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The head of the National Coalition recently, Al-Khatib recently resigned, saying it was all run by foreign powers and he had no influence. So, it's deeply divided. Will they go to negotiate in Geneva? They aren't sure. They think they probably won't. Who will go? They're not sure. So even by the standards of sort of divided oppositions in the world, this one is extraordinarily chaotic.
Patrick Coburn, I wanted to ask you about the role of the United States in the conflict. This is Secretary of State John Kerry speaking Monday.
What is happening in Syria is happening because one man who has been in power with his family for, years now, more than 40 years, will not consent to an appropriate process by which the people of Syria can protect minorities, be inclusive, and have the people of Syria decide their future. He has decided to protect himself and his regime's interests by reaching out across state lines and actually soliciting the help of Iran on the ground with fighters, as well as Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. A designated terrorist organization has now crossed over from Lebanon into Syria and is actively engaged in the fighting.
Your response, Patrick Coburn, to Secretary of State John Kerry, and also the fact that the U.S. is deploying Patriot anti-aircraft missiles and F-16 fighter jets to Syria's neighbor Jordan this month. Jordan saying the planes will be used for an exercise, but others are speculating other things.
Well, I think, it's pretty distressing. What Kerry says is, I'm afraid, sort of, demonstrably untrue. All you have to do is ask yourself, if Assad went tomorrow, would the fighting stop? And you bet it wouldn't, because it's a civil war. It's not just Assad, but it's, a whole group of people. I mean, somebody said to me in Damascus not so long ago, that 15% of the population support the government, 15% of the rebels, and 70% just want the war to end. But to see this purely a personal thing about does Assad go or stay, I think is very oversimplified. I can't believe that Kerry believes that. As for foreign intervention, the Tunisian government admitted recently that I think 800 of its Tunisians were fighting on the rebel side, and Tunisian security said it was about 2,000. Islamic fundamentalists have been pouring in from all over the world, just like they once did in Afghanistan or more recently in Iraq. So that really isn't true. I think that, I don't know how far this oversimplification is believed in by the State Department or the White House, but what is needed in Syria, and I think what is unfortunate, is that this prevents real negotiations taking place. If you have negotiations which say Assad's a precondition that Assad will go, well, that's absurd because he controls most of the country. If you say the Iranians can't turn up or have any role, but hold on a minute, the Iranians are major players there. You're basically saying, if you have these preconditions, you're basically saying no realistic negotiations. So what I think should happen, and what this avoids, is, basically you have a civil war. Both sides hate each other so much. There have been so many atrocities at this stage that they're not going to agree on the future distribution of power, power sharing, or the future of Syria. The best you can really hope for at this stage is a ceasefire, get the level of violence down, and then that might be later you could have talks about sharing power. But you're not going to have that happen at the moment. I think you should have a ceasefire, and you should have the UN monitoring it. You had a UN force doing this last year. It didn't work perfectly, but it was a lot better than what we had subsequently. You need mediation, local ceasefires, just get the level of violence down, and then you might have talks. But before we do that, I don't think these talks are going to lead anywhere.
Patrick Coburn, I want to turn to recent reports about the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria. On Tuesday, France said tests on chemical samples taken from Syria prove the deadly nerve agent sarin gas has been used several times during the civil conflict. The White House responded by saying it needs more evidence on Syria that chemical weapons have been used. This is White House spokesperson Jay Carney.
We have worked very closely with the French, as well as other allies, as well as the Syrian opposition, to build on the information that we had developed about the likely use of chemical weapons in Syria. And we continue to work with the French and the British and others and the Syrian opposition to do that. I would note that the French report that you're citing says that more work needs to be done to establish who is responsible for the use, and the amount that was used, and more details about the circumstances around it.
Patrick Coburn, that was White House spokesperson Jay Carney. Could you explain the significance of the alleged use of chemical weapons in this conflict?
Well, clearly the rebels feel that if they can prove that it was used by the government, this might lead to foreign intervention. So really all witnesses to this are very partial, whether they're Syrian government or opposition, or indeed their backers. The UN produced a report yesterday saying that evidence that poison gas had been used. They'd interviewed 430 people outside the country, but no information as to who used it, how it was delivered, or what chemical weapons were actually used. I mean, so that really shows us a vacuum of information. The French are now saying this, that it was used, but the French are very partial in favor of the rebels. French intelligence doesn't have a great track record in Syria, or indeed during the lead up to the Iraq War. So I think it's still pretty dubious. You know, a lot of the stuff that comes all from people on the ground, when you talk to them, they're completely convinced that chemical weapons have been used against them. But when you talk to them, they don't know what the effect of chemical weapons. You have people talking about, sarin gas being used and people gasping and so forth. But if you ingest sarin gas, you're dead. People don't sometimes, if it's tear gas, people think it's chemical weapons, and people obviously get completely terrified. But a lot of this evidence that's coming out is very partial, very dubious. Some of the samples, some of the samples that were taken from Syria, a Syrian sympathizer with the rebel was meant to take it to Turkey, to the U.S. officials there. He took 13 days. Nobody had told him what he was carrying. It was in the boot of his car for 5 days. So this is very uncertain stuff.
Patrick
and
Coburn,
interviewing lots of refugees
as we wrap
abroad
up,
doesn't really prove anything.
Patrick, as we wrap up, the press coverage of what's happening in Syria.
I think pretty bad, actually. I mean, I've been covering the Middle East a long time, and it's really the worst I've seen of any conflict there. Why is that? Well, people might say the Syrian government isn't sympathetic to letting people into Damascus. Therefore, it creates a vacuum of information, which is filled by rumor or filled by opposition sources. That's certainly one source of it. I think that the media has been very sort of credulous of taking YouTube evidence as being definitive, while this is mostly taken by political activists. Nothing wrong with that. But there's on television and elsewhere, there's understating of how partial a lot of this evidence is, that the YouTube evidence and is that they're producing. You often have health warnings saying we're not verify that this is true. But the fact that television is running it at all shows that they believe it is true. So I think that that's given a sort of false impression of what's happening. This is a genuine civil war. It may have started as a popular uprising. But I think that all that's been very partial. It's also given the impression that the Assad government's about to collapse, which really was never true. I think this is beginning to be recognized now.
Patrick,
I mean, more recently, I think people are a bit more skeptical, and, you know, video of rebels, rebel commander, you know, cutting open the body of a government soldier and eating his heart, or children cutting off the head of somebody, have shown, you know, that there is a case to be made on both sides. But that's quite recent. But before that, I'm rather amazed the way the foreign media has relied on secondary sources, and secondary sources that are very partial.
Patrick Coburn, I want to thank you very much for being with us, foreign correspondent for The Independent, speaking to us from London, recently back from Syria. We'll link to his article at The Independent. Thanks so much. This is